are some of the influences, what are some of the resources, kind of theologically or just in your thinking, that you've kind of gone to over this last 10, 12 weeks as you sought to try to live within this experience and begin to try to make some kind of sense of it?
Yeah, well, I've been thinking for a little while about three women authors, three women social philosophers of mainly the mid and then the late 20th century. And I've been thinking about them in the context of populism and the crisis of democracy and Brexit and migration. And then just as the COVID stuff hit, I realised that what I was finding helpful in those other areas was actually, to my mind anyway, quite helpful in thinking about some of the early stages of lockdown. And the really interesting thing is that these are three women who would disagree violently amongst themselves. So it's not as if these are three women thinkers who, you know, just line up neatly behind each other. But I kind of felt like we needed all of them. So I ended up writing 3 different blog pieces, because I've only been able to think at the length of a blog piece for the last however long anyway. I can't think in longer thought form than that. But I ended up needing to write 3 separate pieces because I couldn't put them in the same piece because I couldn't get them to agree enough with each other, but they all had something really important to say. So, I mean, just to say perhaps a little bit about what I felt they had in common and why they were helpful to now. First of all, so the 3 women are Simone Weil, who was a mid-century Jewish by background French philosopher who basically became largely Christian, although she was never baptized. But she became a kind of Christian mystic, and she died in the mid-1940s in London as a refugee. So she ended up displaced from France to the US and then to the UK, where she died. And she wrote a lot about rootedness and the human need for rootedness and what happens when the conditions of our lives uproot us. And she doesn't mean that just in terms of people who end up being refugees. She believed that the conditions that we were living under economically, politically, socially, culturally, spiritually, in the mid-20th century were ones that uprooted everybody. Even if you go nowhere and you never move, you're living uprooted from the really important things that human beings need to anchor them in communities. So I ended up thinking a bit about her, and particularly in her work, what I was drawn to was she talks a lot about suffering. So she, as an academic, and I really admire this, she went off, she gave up her teaching job, and she went off to a Renault factory to see what it would be like to work on the front line of a factory, on the factory floor. And she decided that the kind of people who wrote newspaper columns, who wrote opinion pieces for newspapers, this won't sound at all familiar, were kind of the chattering classes who had all of these articulate theories that they developed in university about how the world worked, but in actual fact knew nothing about the real conditions that people lived in. So she thought by going and giving up her own life, her own teaching life, and going and working on the factory floor, that people would be kind of better than the columnists. She would just be able to plug straight into this incredibly articulate experience of working class life and really understand what was going on. So you didn't need Marxist theory, you just needed to get close to a kind of working context. But what she actually found when she went was that the kind of suffering that people were experiencing through very monotonous, precarious work did not make them instantly articulate. In fact, what came with the brutalizing of the body and the soul through that kind of work at that point was an inarticulacy. And she writes about the way in which suffering can produce inarticulacy in us. And at the beginning of lockdown, when so many people were saying to me, I'm finding it really hard to put into words how I feel and what's going on and why, I kept thinking about their inarticulacy and the way in which certain conditions, when the way that we want to live well with others, being productive, having control over what happens in your own life, and being able to manage time as a sequence and a flow. These are all crucial things that we need to survive. And I knew all of that because refugees tell me that about what gets disrupted for them and the psychological impact of that. So I thought, it's kind of no wonder that we feel kind of inarticulate about this experience. So anyway, I ended up working on a bit on they in that light. But the second thinker who I needed, who again is another thinker of rupture, who allows her thought, all 3 women do this, they allow their thinking, their philosophy to be interrupted by real events. So by displacement, by the Holocaust, by political crisis, they're willing to allow that interruption. So the second figure that was kind of willing to do that and needed to was Hannah Arendt, who again was a mid-century thinker, but she did survive the war. Again, she was German Jewish refugee, ended up in the United States, very famous because she covered the Eichmann trial and invented phrases like the banality of evil. But the bit of her work that I was really excited by and thought, no, this is really helpful, is about the way in which we become public selves. So she talks about, we know that we're social beings. At the beginning of lockdown, didn't we know that we were social beings and we'd lost that side to our lives? Also that we're private beings. And again, one of the strange things about lockdown is that actually suddenly the most private parts of your life become subject to scrutiny, comment, control. So we knew we were private people and wanted to be more private than we could be. We knew we were social people, but Arendt says the danger is that you forget that you're public beings as well. And that if you try to suppress that public side to who you are, then that has major consequences, both for you as an individual and for the well-being of public life more generally. And I was really fascinated by the way in which, in one sense, if you were a key worker, everything about what you were doing was suddenly even more public. So you didn't lose that sense of publicness. It became intensified in a way. But for the rest of us, we lost that public dimension to our lives, whether it's the places that we went to be public or almost a right to do what Arendt thinks we should do, which is constantly contest and argue about the best way that we should live our public lives. So what you do is you conform and you're patriotic and you accept lockdown and all the rest of it. But the space to really contest COVID and to think about what kind of public life was fit for purpose in a COVID moment, that space, we seem to become very uncertain of how to do that. And how to live in that space. So I became very interested in Arendt for that reason. And the third figure, and then I'll stop, is Gillian Rose, who I wrote my PhD on. And the bit of Rose I was really interested in, she was a British social philosopher, again, Jewish by background, became Christian on her deathbed. She was received into the church by the former Bishop of Coventry, Simon Barrington Ward, very influential on Rowan Williams, and Rowan very influential on her. And Rose talks about the need for a politics of mourning, as in a politics of grief. And I found her language around the politics of mourning suddenly coming back to me. I'd, worked on this 20 years ago, but I suddenly thought, no, this is what she's talking about. And she talks about the need for a politics that can handle failure, that understands what you do when things fail, when there are unintended outcomes, or what is revealed to you is such a level of structural injustice that you have to stop and take stock and venture again. And she talks about two pathways that are really problematic and we shouldn't go for politically. One she calls the path of euphoria, as in just blind utopian optimism. And I think there was a little bit, I'll say something controversial. There was a little bit of that at the beginning of lockdown. It's all going to be great. We're all going to become ecologically minded. No one's ever going to drive a car again. No one's ever going to go on holiday. This is the ecological conversion moment and it's all going to be great. And I wish that was the case, believe you me. But that kind of, euphoric, this is the moment, this is what we needed and it's going to be fine. She says she's very suspicious of that kind of way of doing politics. She's also suspicious of the endless pessimism, just the politics of despair that imagines that you can never improve anything, so why bother taking the risk? And she talks about a third pathway, which is neither of those things, not the despair nor the euphoria, but rather a pathway that says, oh my God, I don't know what to do and it's a mess, but we have to risk something. We have to accept that we are at a loss to know what to do and yet must act. So I became very interested in that. How do you act with an awareness of failure, but also with a degree of hopefulness, not optimism, but a degree of hopefulness that it is possible to construct a life together. So they became the women thinkers who were helpful to me, and all of them are very unsentimental thinkers. They refuse to be sentimental about suffering and difficulty. They just think the world is a slightly incommodious place and you just have to get on with it and be hopeful anyway. So Rose begins her most famous book with a quote from a Christian mystic: "Keep your mind in hell, but despair not."
That's always a great way to finish a little segment. Thanks, Tyler. I guess we've talked in the last time we did one of these, we were with Luke Brotherton, who talked a lot about moving from surviving to thriving and various different bits of that. And we began to touch on this idea of public life within that. And I guess, in his terms, would be the common life together. I guess when you talk about Arendt and public life, she's got quite a complex reading of that, of different aspects of that. Could you just kind of map those different things out for us,
Yeah.
just so that we get a sense of where she's coming from?
Yeah, yeah. So she's obsessed with this idea of the public, because this is where we're saved. We're saved through public life. And of course, one of the questions just to hold on to ask from a Christian point of view about Arendt's work is whether she imagines too much that we'll be saved by this public life, by this common life, whether there's almost too much faith in that. But nonetheless, to give her a fair reading, she would say that the public, our public life, is constituted in two main ways. The first, or there's two meanings to it. So the first meaning of public life is not necessarily the one we'd think of, like, public life means institutions. It means the public library, the courts, the police. She doesn't think about it as buildings and institutions, but rather the first meaning of public life is it's the space in which we come to appear to each other. So it's a space of appearance in which, beyond kin and family and friendship, so beyond those private relationships, it's a space of appearance in which it is possible to come together. And she uses this brilliant phrase in which she says, public life is constituted when I see what you see and hear what you hear. So it's this space of common recognition and appearance. And by seeing what you see, hearing what you hear, it becomes possible to find a shared interest between us. So you negotiate almost what St. Augustine would call common loves. And she did her PhD on Augustine. So you negotiate common loves as the basis of common life. So that's the bit that's probably quite like what Luke talked about last time, I'm guessing. It's the negotiation of common life, and it's the space of appearance. And he's worked a bit on Arendt over the years. But there's another meaning to public life, which is less sentimental, and it simply is the world as it is. So in other words, there's a givenness to the public I am born into and I die into. My children are born into, and that world is a world of structure and relationships in which justice or injustice will thrive, in which the cards are already laid to some extent, and I have to negotiate within that space of limit. So it is the things that bring us together, but also the things that divide us, the things that I don't get to just decide on by finding these common loves together. And I like and find helpful in her work that she wants to hold both of those meanings of the public together, that there's this space of hopefulness in which we can simply appear to each other in new ways and create new politics in that space. And that we're not just defined by institutions. Institutions are important, but we're not just defined by them. The public is this fluid, interactive thing that's constantly regenerated. And if you think about the Black Lives Matters protests, you can see the public being regenerated in front of your eyes. That for her is that space of appearance. I see what you see, I hear what you hear, and vice versa. But the fact she's willing to talk about a kind of givenness of structures as well as that second meaning, I find that helpful.
And does, within that then, has the public life shrunk with COVID? In lockdown, does that shrink for us, or does it mutate? Does it create new possibilities, or how does that work?
I would have thought all of those things. That would be my hunch, but I think we can only know what's happened by talking about it together.
Yeah.
By us all together seeing what each other see, hearing what each other hear. So we can only know the answer to that together, because it requires the coming together of perception and a common space of judgment to decide that. And I think personally, my response would be that all of those things have happened. That on the one hand, there's been a shrinking of a space, and we felt that early on in lockdown, quite, it became very tricky to challenge certain things. But it's also true that it's morphed and mutated, and new forms of what are we doing on Zoom now? New forms of public life have come into being. And actually, my experience of teaching into a Zoom space has been that all sorts of factors that would have limited a Durham classroom have not limited what I've been able to do online. And so actually, almost I think there's probably been less structural injustice affecting some of my teaching stuff that I've been able to do online.
If all our examples of where the public is morphed into are effectively online spaces. What about those who are offline, who actually for them to engage, that it becomes another barrier to them actually showing up within the public discourse, or having a parallel discourse that doesn't actually engage with this? How do you see that working out?
Well, I mean, one, the digital divide is clearly huge, and any attempt to talk about what's happened to public life without talking about that digital divide is problematic. And I mean, you would know this and be able to say far more, Andrew, from your experience of the poverty truth stuff. So, you know, probably you should comment on this. But the only thing I would just say as proviso is I don't think everything has gone online. I don't think it's just a divide between the sort of digital haves and have-nots, because the Black Lives Matters protests, the counter right-wing protests at the weekend, there's been this re-eruption into public space of protest, resistance, and this absolutely determined need to appear to each other. And the benign side of that, the kind of most romantic, sentimental side of that, was the clap each Thursday, where people needed desperately to appear to each other.
Yeah.
And so they created that space of appearance, in Arendt's terms, by coming out onto their doorstep, appearing in public. You know, that became the brief manifestation of that. The more kind of jarring, difficult one has been the protests, well, globally, but, you know, in the US, and for us here as well. So I think we've got all of this going on simultaneously. And I think one of the really difficult things is how you form a meaningful public out of all of these different disparate elements. How do you bring the different elements into conversation with each other? And to my mind, it's a bit of a 1968 moment where you've got all of these different things happening almost chaotically in the same space, and you've no idea where or what it might lead to. Something constructive or not, a coalition of those interests or not, and where's the space of leadership at the grassroots level, or at a more sort of horrible word, elite level, that enables these to be properly brokering spaces in which you get some kind of common life out of that.
Yeah, I've been really interested in the Black Lives Matter stuff, obviously, and I think everybody's been impacted by it. I guess I've also been very aware of my own whiteness within it, and my own the danger of tweeting out what I think are really, you know, fantastic thoughts, and but actually, what integrity do I have there? I had a conversation with a friend on Monday who is a church leader within Leeds, and he was saying, look, I know everybody wants me to tweet about Black Lives Matter. Everybody wants me in some ways to show up publicly to say something about it. But I feel so inauthentic within doing that, that the only reason why I'm doing it is to make a public statement. And I'm always intrigued with things like this, is how do we show up in a way that in some ways doesn't re-emphasize the fact that we have, I guess, in my case, white privilege that enables me to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, I had a really interesting conversation with my third year students on Friday about this, and they were talking, and you know, I'd own that myself as well, about the awkwardness of knowing what your response should be. And I think living with the awkwardness, not in some sentimental self-indulgent fashion, but living with the awkwardness and the difficulty of that and the inarticulacy of it, to go back to Bay's language, is quite important to an honest response to the experience, that there are ways to act and show solidarity, but also, you know, it is acutely difficult. And it feels to me like we've moved from the kind of racial politics of 10 years ago in terms of an ability to name white privilege, to name some of the difficulties, for me speaking personally as a white woman with huge amounts of privilege, working out what my responsibility is and what space I need to be in and occupy. I mean, the other thing that I think, other than sort of being honest and dealing with the awkwardness of it and that being okay, is also to say, we're living in this fast-paced, reactive populist era in which the likes of Trump and Bolsonaro and Orban and whoever else you want to add to that, you know, list of horrors, they are unthinking people who want this kind of action, reaction, thing all the time. And actually, one of the things that's necessary, given how unthinking that politics is part of resistance to that, is actually to create pockets of reflection and thinking. And that one of the responses needs to be time and space to think together, not to get lost in a cycle of endless introspection, but actually the act of thinking. And we know that the pace of thinking is the pace of walking, about 3 miles an hour. You know, that being willing to stop and say, I don't know the answer to all of this, but I do know that I need to think about this honestly and wrestle with it, and to slow that pace. You know, I think that can be helpful too. And thinking is resistance as well.
Okay, just explain that a little bit more. What do you mean by it being resistance?
That if we live in an era of instant action and reaction, which feels breathless. I mean, both the pandemic and also the George Floyd thing, I can't breathe, the breathlessness of the entire experience, it's all over the place. We experience that in multiple ways. And actually, one of the ways in which you can respond to that is by engaging in a degree of thoughtfulness that allows you to breathe and allows you to think with others in a constructive way that doesn't just feed the same cycle and build the same kind of anxiety. I mean, the other thing we haven't talked about or named is the fact that, and again, my students are hugely articulate about this, is that the pandemic brings with it hugely raised levels of social anxiety. So we're thinking under conditions of anxiety, and we know from the Christian tradition, I mean, the patristic fathers are brilliant on this, anxiety does not breed good thought. Honest wrestling with fear does. So fear is motivating. It has a concrete object to it. Fear is not necessarily a bad thing. Anxiety is. Anxiety for the patristic fathers is of the devil. It paralyzes you. It mushrooms and it locks you down.
And yet there's an anxiety is possibly pushing the public forward into trying to move back out of lockdown. And I one of the conversations that actually Martin, who's on the call, and I were having yesterday, is that actually there is this kind of pragmatism that we've got to move forward, and it's within kind of funding organizations at the moment of, you know, let's pay for those that are going to feed people, not necessarily those projects that are going to cause new kind of spaces of thinking and of interaction that will create new possibilities. How do we, I mean, a range of people are on this call. Many of them are involved in community, church life in a grassroots way. How do we start to be those resistant communities of thinking in a world that could quite easily get carried away with trying to get back to business as near to what it was before as they can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a difference between a sort of honest and very difficult encounter with risk, because, you know, we cannot live human lives that do not involve risk, negotiating risk, taking risk. What you have to do is reflect on that risk and make as responsible a decision as you can, but there will be failure. And there will be difficulty, and you will not have cast iron guarantees. So part of the pandemic stuff seems to me that it intensifies those questions, honest, good questions about risk, in a finite world where we have to confront limit and difficulty and incompleteness. Okay, that's fine. So dealing honestly with risk and helping people negotiate risk is a good thing. Feeding a cycle of anxiety or making decisions out of a space of anxiety rarely leads to good outcomes, I think, and helping people discern whether their response is a sort of anxious one. I have to get out of lockdown because, you know, and there can be a very anxious cycle to that thinking, which is understandable because it's what it does to us. But, you know, I think an ability to sort of distinguish between necessary risk, which is ethical to negotiate, and cycles of intense anxiety, and how to calm that anxiety and open up better spaces for common judgment and common action, but knowing that there isn't one that doesn't involve risk.